Good day. Before I start this video, this is just to remind you all that you can on occasion find our videos now on Rumble's homepage. That's to say the Duran videos, and that if you search for us in the search bar on Rumble's homepage, you will find all of our channels, my channel, Alex Christophorou's channel, the Duran channel, by typing our names into the search bar. That will take you directly to our channels where you can watch them. And if you watch them on Rumble, you will see at the top of the video a red maroon button which you can press, and that will take you directly to our locals homepage, where there's a thriving community, lots of people posting on all kinds of matters, and where Alex and I are increasingly publishing exclusive content, with myself doing live streams every Wednesday. Now, the other thing I just wanted to say is, I'm going to say it more briefly this time, which is that obviously we are in an extremely tense international situation at the moment. I have no reason to feel concerned about the presence of my channel or any of our channels on any particular platform, but in case that changes, please remember that you can find us on Rumble and Locals, and of course on other platforms like SuperU and Odyssey. So, to proceed, this is going to be a relatively short video because there's been a huge amount of activity in Ukraine over the last few hours. I think it can be summarized fairly quickly and fairly briefly. Firstly, there's been a great deal more shelling and fighting in Donbass, though it's important to say that there has not been any major move in the front lines. The officials of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, claim that they have been the subject of attack by what they call sabotage groups, and the Russian authorities claim that two of these sabotage groups managed to break into Russia, cross over into Russia, where they were intercepted and destroyed by the Russian military and security services. Ukraine vehemently denies these claims, claiming that they're all fake news. They insist that they are the target of provocations, that they're not shelling the Donbass, or at least not in any great extent, that they are the principal targets and victim of the shelling, and that these people who the Russians say crossed over into Ukraine either don't exist, or that it's somehow a staged event. And they also denied that there were any sabotage groups, or that the Ukrainian military is preparing to take any offensive action at all. Now, in these kind of conflicts, the most important thing is to realize that in a war situation, everybody has a strong incentive to tell, shall we say, less than the truth. It's not unknown for people to invent and fabricate events in order to try to win support and sympathy. I'm sure the Ukrainians do this, and I have no doubt that the people in the Donbass, the militia in the Donbass, do so as well. There's been some attempts which I've seen, not all of which I have found fully convincing, by the way, to cast doubt on some of the particular incidents that some of the militia people have been claiming have happened. But I'm fully willing to accept that some of them have perhaps been staged, presumably with the intention of winning support amongst people in Russia. Having said that, it's important to say that there is some degree of external corroboration for what is taking place in eastern Ukraine at the moment, and that is provided by two independent organizations. One is the monitoring mission of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. There's about 700 observers on this mission, scattered across the line of contact, and they are there to observe the ceasefire. Now, a few days ago, about a week ago, the United States, Britain and Canada pulled out all of their people from the OSCE mission, and they apparently have been replaced by others. So the mission is apparently up to strength and operating, but without the presence of the Americans, the British and the Canadians. And they have been providing reports and situation maps, which I should say I personally find difficult to read, in part because I have vision problems, which makes it difficult for me to read maps clearly, but which those who have done say show indisputably that by far the greatest amount of the shelling has been carried out by the Ukrainians against the people in the Donbass and not vice versa. Now, as I said, I've not able to verify this fully myself because, as I said, I struggle, I have difficulty, especially with maps and reading these maps and things. But I have no doubt, no reason to doubt that those who claim to have read these OSCE reports and say that they show that most of the shelling has been done by the Ukrainian army are telling the truth. In one case, I know the person in question, and I have no doubt at all as to his personal and professional integrity. So that does show, or at least so it seems to me, that most of the shelling, the greater part of it, by far the greater part of it, has been carried out by the Ukrainian military. The second agency or organisation that I place a great deal of weight on is the Red Cross. And again, this is an organisation which I have in the past had dealings with and am familiar with. I've had personal dealings with people who work in the Red Cross. And by the way, on one occasion, I actually brought to the attention of the Red Cross a matter which I thought would be of particular interest to it, and which did in fact result in the Red Cross taking certain action. It's a long time ago, and I'm not going to discuss what it was. All I will say is that, again, I have a great deal of faith and confidence in the Red Cross, and they are saying that there are extremely severe humanitarian conditions in the Donbass, that there are problems with power supplies, apparently problems with water, sort of things that the people, the officials of the Donbass are alleging, and the Red Cross again appears to confirm that those claims are true. So, though I think it is quite possible that some of the individual incidents may have been staged, it seems to me that the overall picture is indeed of heavy Ukrainian bombardment on the Donbass, obviously provoking some degree of counter-bombardment, but definitely it is the Ukrainians who are doing most of the shelling. I say that, as I said, based on the reports of those two organisations, in which I have confidence. Now, I would add that last night there were lots of reports in the Russian media that the Ukrainians were about to launch their great and much talked about and anticipated offensive on the Donbass, but nothing like that actually happened. Now, that may be because they're encountering more resistance than they expected, or it may be because they've been slowed down by the diplomatic efforts that are going on. And these have been extremely extensive. And as always, the central figure is the French President, Emmanuel Macron. And he has been phenomenally busy. He's been talking to almost everybody. He had 2 massive telephone calls with Putin. The first one lasted 110 minutes. The second one lasted about an hour. He spoke with President Biden of the United States. That conversation apparently lasted only 15 minutes. he's talking apparently to, he also spoke to Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Britain. He also apparently spoke to, or is intending to speak to, Chancellor Schulz of Germany. So this is somebody who is working the phones at a level of extraordinary intensity, and he's trying clearly to achieve some sort of diplomatic outcome. And for once, the French readouts of his conversations with Putin are in some way more informative than the Russian ones. Now, I say that because they're full of plans and schemes and ideas of the sort that Macron has always danced with. So there's supposed to be urgent meetings of the tripartite contact group. There's supposed to be arrangements to set up some kind of immediate ceasefire. There's talk about discussions and summit meetings which will bring together all the stakeholders. Not quite sure what that means exactly, but anyway, it's a plan apparently to reconsider or look at the entire security situation, the entire security architecture in Europe, without, however, going into any specifics at all as to precisely what that means. And of course, there's also attempts by Macron to set up some kind of summit meeting between Biden and Putin. This is supposed to be discussed by Blinken and Lavrov on Thursday, though it's as yet completely unclear to me what the summit meeting, if it takes place, is supposed to discuss. And his foreign minister, Le Drian, is also busy. He's also apparently talking to Lavrov, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, and he's talking with all sorts of other people. And of course, he's talking to the Ukrainians in the same way as Macron himself was talking. But as I said, all of these very elegantly expressed, beautifully crafted, but I have to say very general ideas and proposals that Macron is floating seem to be having no effect, or at least minimal effect, on the situation on the ground. I mean, it's possible that the fact that Macron has been working the phones in this kind of way may have persuaded the Ukrainians to hold back if they were indeed intending to launch some kind of offensive last night. But I can't say for certain that that is so, and certainly the shelling has continued today and is still continuing despite all of the things that Macron has said. So far, there's been no meeting of the tripartite contact group. There's been no resurrection of the Normandy 4. And of course, we come back to this. Macron has never actually had the courage to come out and express what I am sure are his convictions, which are that the reason that there is this crisis is because Ukraine is refusing to implement the Minsk agreement, and because some people in NATO will not give up on this fictional principle of expanding NATO eastwards. So unless and until Macron is prepared to come out openly and say what has to be said, that France will oppose the eastward expansion of NATO and will oppose under any circumstances Ukraine joining NATO, and unless Macron also says that it is Ukraine that is violating the Minsk agreement by not implementing it, I can't really see that all these clever and ingenious and intricate ideas that he is coming up with are going to achieve very much mileage with the Russians. And that, to my mind, explains the Russian readouts. Now, I'm not going to waste time by reading either the French or the Russian readouts, providing links. People can read them for themselves. But one of the things that struck me about the Russian readouts is that there was nowhere in the principal Russian readout, there was no indication at all that the Russians were really receptive to any of the specific ideas that Macron is floating. I think Putin's patience, and I think the patience of many people in Moscow, is exhausted. And though I think they have some respect for Macron, who's at least trying, I think they've concluded, probably rightly, that at the end of the day, he's simply not going to be able to deliver. And my reading of the Russian readouts certainly points in that direction. I would also say that it's quite clear that Olaf Scholz, the new German Chancellor, blundered badly whilst he was in Moscow. I've said whilst I was discussing this press conference he had with Putin that he came across to me as clunky and rather dim, and I'm afraid the effects of his visit and of some of the things he said since his visit have rather reinforced that belief. He made that disastrous observation, first of all, that there'd not been any kind of war in Europe until Putin reminded him of the attack on Yugoslavia in 1999. I meant no war in Europe since the Second World War, obviously. And then Scholz went and doubled down and said, well, there'd been some kind of genocide being perpetrated in Yugoslavia, in Albania, and that was what provoked the war. And that made the Russians angry and made Putin angry. And he said that as far as Russia is concerned, what is taking place in Ukraine, in the Donbass, is a genocide. And a wise leader, a wise chancellor, would never have fallen into the mistake of making that kind of comment. But Scholz did. And when he went to the security conference in Munich, he doubled down on it by denying that there was any kind of genocide going on in the Donbass. I think for Russians, getting lectures from a German chancellor about genocide is maladroit diplomacy, to put it mildly, and I think that raised many hackles in Moscow. But I think beyond that, and in addition to it, Scholz did something which I think he expected to be conciliatory to the Russians and to try to win them round, but without realizing that in the way that he was doing it, it was actually going to rile them. He told them that there is no prospect anytime soon of Ukraine joining NATO. He said that this is not on anybody's agenda. That's not true, by the way. It's constantly on Ukraine's agenda, and that it's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. And whilst that's true, Scholz seems to have believed or persuaded himself that him merely going to Moscow and saying that to the Russians would somehow cause the Russians to feel pleased and to be reassured and to take whatever de-escalatory moves Scholz was expecting them to make. He seems to have been completely oblivious to the fact that the Russians would not accept simple verbal assurance on this point. They point out to the fact that at the Budapest NATO conference in 2008, NATO said that Ukraine and Georgia would indeed one day become members of NATO, and that has never been drawn back. And they also, of course, remember the promises which, according to Der Spiegel, they were indisputably given, all those verbal promises, they were indisputably given at the time when the Soviet Union broke up and the Warsaw Pact was dismantled, that NATO would not expand an inch east. So Scholz seems to have assumed that his reassurance would satisfy the Russians without reflecting that the Russians, having already been tricked, as they see it, by verbal reassurances of that nature in the past, are not going to fall for that same trick again. And I think that has riled the Russians exceedingly. So I think that Schulz probably went to Moscow looking to calm things down. But in fact, he said things to the Russians which, to be straightforward about it, annoyed and irritated them. Damage would probably have been avoided, and it might have been possible to move forward. He did say, whilst he was in Moscow, that he was pressing Zelensky to come up with proposals for autonomy for the Donbass, which would be presented to the Trilateral Contact Group. But of course, when the fighting began, the shelling began in the Donbass on Thursday, all that in turn turned to dust. And I think the Russians again concluded that Schulz is prepared to say all sorts of things, but he's not in any kind of position to deliver, and that he won't, in fact, deliver, just as Macron won't. So, as a result, we've had the big event of the day, which is the meeting of the Russian Security Council. And this was staged as a public meeting with a procession of top officials speaking and explaining their positions to Putin, who's listening carefully to what they had to say. Now, all of this was televised and made public to the Russian people. And here I'm going to say a few things about the Russian Security Council, because it is to some extent misnamed. It's not a entity that only deals with foreign and security matters, though that's certainly one of its major provinces. It is, in fact, the top policy-making body of Russia. Putin chairs it. He has wide leeway in choosing who sits on it, but it has to be said that some of the people who sit on that council or committee are there because of their political authority and because they're major stakeholders in the Russian power system. And it was interesting to note also where this meeting took place. It took place in the Catherine Hall of the Senate building of the Kremlin. And of course, Russians who are historically minded, which is to say the great majority of them, will not have failed to notice that this particular room was where in former times the Soviet Central Committee used to meet. This is in Stalin's day and in Lenin's day, and where of course Stalin himself would have given various speeches to the Central Committee, the Soviet Central Committee, and by extension to the party and the people. So this is a particular public space, or perhaps governmental space in Russia, which for Russians is redolent with history and meaning. And perhaps it's worth pointing out at this point that the whole debate, this open debate that took place in the Security Council, was full of references to historical events and to literature. There were quotations from the novel Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, for example. There were references to the Battle of Kursk and the Battle of the Donbass in the Second World War. There were some comparisons made with the way in which Ukraine wasn't implementing the Minsk agreement and was complaining that this was something that had been imposed on Ukraine following a military defeat. And one of the participants in this meeting said that this was an absurd position. It was as if Germany in 1945, having signed an agreement, a capitulation, then refused to implement it and said that it wouldn't do so. You have all of these historical and literary analogies, very unusual to a Western ear, but very common to a Russian one. Russians know their history and they're very literary minded, and many of these comments will of course have come through. Now, the purpose of this Security Council meeting was to consider the situation in Donbass, and the purported object of the discussion was to debate whether or not Russia should recognize the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. The most formidable speech, and in some ways the strongest speech, was made by the former Russian President, Dmitry Medvedev, who's now the deputy chair of the Security Council. He's often been thought of and spoken of by people, including people in Russia, as somehow a liberal or a pro-Westerner. I've never understood that. He took, in fact, a pretty strong line and recommended, as far as I could see, their recognition. And he also said that if Russia did recognize these two republics, then there would be an enormous uproar, there'd be sanctions, there'd be pressure, but sooner or later things would calm down and the West would have to talk to Russia because it would have no choice. And anyway, that was Medvedev's view, and I think it's fair to say that the only real argument that took place over the course of this meeting, the only real debate, if it was a debate, was on whether to recognize these two breakaway republics of Ukraine immediately, to recognize them as independent states, or to delay doing so for several days to see whether any part of Macron's feverish diplomatic activity could yield results. And Putin, at the end of the meeting, said that he would go away and think about what everybody has said and presumably reconvene in private session with all of these people and inform them of his decision, and that decision will be made public over the course of the day. Quite probably, by the time that you're watching this video, that decision will indeed have been made public. Now, I don't know what that decision is going to be. I'm going to guess that Putin will give Macron a little more time, maybe until Thursday, when Lavrov is due to meet with Blinken, and to see whether this summit is organized. I think the Russians will certainly want some kind of a ceasefire in effect before then. But I don't think they're going to wait for more than just a few days. And it was quite clear that many officials, most of the officials in this meeting, thought that the decision should be made at once and immediately. So that's, I think, what Putin is going to do. But he is the master of his own counsel. And of course, he doesn't share his opinions and views with me. So we'll just have to see what he decides. But either way, what it does show, I think, is that we are coming to the end of this particular affair. Now, a number of points need to be made very clear here. First of all, it seems to me that one possibility, which we can now confidently rule out, it's a possibility which no one suggested, is of an all-out war in Ukraine, a march on Kiev, any of these lurid and dramatic things which we have been reading about in the media and hearing from the US administration and from the British over the last few weeks. Nobody in that meeting in Moscow seemed to contemplate or even consider that possibility. One official did suggest that the Russians take steps to bring under the control of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics all the territories that are part of the oblasts, the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Now, we'll see whether that is done or not, but that seems to be the maximum extent of any military action which is being contemplated at the moment. In other words, this is going to be confined to eastern Ukraine. A march on Kiev is not on the agenda. The second thing I would say about this meeting is that, of course, obviously, if Russia does recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, it will be the only state, I suspect, to do so. Maybe one or two minor ones will follow. Perhaps Belarus will do so. But the point is not, I think, to gain worldwide recognition of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. It will be to get those two republics to confirm, to formally request as independent states military assistance from Russia. And at that point, I suspect that the Russians will undertake what I'm sure they will refer to as a peace enforcement operation, which will be intended to secure the Donbass, to push the Ukrainian army back, to end this military intervention, the fighting that's going on in eastern Ukraine at the moment. It may extend to include places like Mariupol. We'll just have to wait and see. But that, it seems to me, is what this agenda is. If there is a decision by the Russians, and I think this is probably what Putin is going to do, if there is a decision by the Russians to defer recognition for, say, 3 days, to be very clear, that will be, in effect, an ultimatum. It will demand for an immediate ceasefire and for steps to be taken rapidly to implement the Minsk agreement, or the Russians will intervene in the way that I've said and launch this peace enforcement operation, clear the Ukrainian army from the Donbass, and secure peace in the Donbass. And that, I think, needs to be made very clear, because I think that is what the Russians are contemplating. Now, no doubt, all sorts of people in the West will then say that this is a Russian invasion. In fact, I've no doubt that they will. And for what it's worth, I'm pretty sure that what will then follow is that the West will debate with itself the imposition of all the various sanctions it's been talking about. These sanctions, which we've heard about already, the US administration has said previously would represent the top of the escalatory ladder. In other words, there's nothing further, realistically, that the Western powers would be able to do to the Russians beyond those sanctions which are now being discussed. Now, I think if Western policymakers have two brain cells to rub together, which is debatable, they might contemplate what that means. If the Russians send their troops and clear the Donbass and recognize these two republics, they will not have occupied all of Ukraine. They will only actually have cleared a small fraction of Ukrainian territory, a larger segment of Ukraine's population, but only a fraction of Ukraine's territory. Russia has been complaining bitterly and angrily about the discriminatory practices against Russian speakers in the rest of Ukraine, places like Odessa, and Kherson, and Nikolaev, and Kharkiv, and all the rest. If the top escalatory sanctions are imposed on Russia, if the Russians make this relatively proportionate and contained move, then logically the United States and the Western powers have no particular instruments that they can play, no further sanctions that they can pull out from the hat in the event that the Russians decide at some future date that the situation of Russian speakers elsewhere in Ukraine has become so critical that Russia must advance and start to take action to clear places like Odessa, Kherson, and all the rest. So I think Western leaders perhaps should consider their sanctions moves very carefully over the next few days. The Russians are not following the script that has been set out for them. Kiev has been essentially abandoned and is being held out like a kind of bait. The Russians are not taking that bait. They're taking what they would say is a proportionate response. It will throw the initiative, the decision back on the West as to what the West does. And of course, if it moves forward with all the full range of sanctions which it's talking about, then it may find that it has no cards left to play when the situation escalates again. And escalate, I'm afraid it will, because though the Donbass will have been cleared, Ukraine will not, of course, recognize the loss of the two Donetsk republics. There's been talk about this, but I doubt that it can be done. I doubt Ukrainian leaders will do this. There will be a sense of deep humiliation in Kiev, and no doubt there will be more attempts at that point to insist on Ukraine entering NATO, something which Western governments are extremely averse to doing. And undoubtedly the Ukrainians will redouble their efforts to Ukrainize what is left of Ukraine. So that, it seems to me, opens up the possibility for more problems going down the road, with West having few or no cards left to play if the situation escalates again. So I think Western governments need to think this through carefully. Whether they will, I strongly doubt, but they were listening to my advice, which of course they're not, then that's my advice to them. Well, the other thing I'm going to say is that it seems to me that we are now, especially with respect to the Donbass, in what is now essentially the end game. I've repeatedly said in program after program on this channel and on the Duran that the Russians would not abandon the Donbass. Putin has said it, other Russian officials have said it, and after the Security Council meeting today, no one can be under any doubt about this. Either there is an immediate ceasefire within the next few hours and a return to negotiations, probably a return to real negotiations, or some sort of Russian peace enforcement operation will take place over the next couple of hours or days, which will secure the Donbass and bring this latest spiral of violence to an end. Sanctions will, of course, follow. All the problems that Medvedev and others spoke about at the Security Council meeting. The Russian economy will suffer a knock. That's undoubted. The Ukrainian economy will suffer an even bigger knock. That is indisputable. Western countries faced with these sanctions might find themselves facing all sorts of problems. As Gazprom reported yesterday, there is practically no gas left in Europe's underground gas storage facilities. There's still some of the winter left. The liquefied natural gas terminals, according to Reuters, are blocked. They're not able to absorb capacity. There'll be no doubt more declines in gas over the course of the summer months. Energy prices are going to spike. And to be straightforward about this, the situation in Europe without Nord Stream 2 coming online, that, it seems to me, going to be almost certainly doomed now if things turn out as the Security Council meeting says. With Nord Stream 2 no longer operating, with the issue, the question of more gas passing through Ukrainian pipelines now becoming increasingly problematic, with all of this, Europe could find itself facing a very difficult energy situation next winter. And of course, there's also going to be other consequences for food prices, all happening at a time when inflation all across the industrialized world is already becoming, as economists like to say, elevated. So this is a difficult situation. Russia will face a difficult situation. Markets there have fallen, as one might have expected, though not perhaps by the catastrophic levels that some might have imagined. But certainly they will have difficulties. The West is going to have difficulties too. So It's a good question to me, to my mind, what the West now does over the next couple of days. If they were sensible, they would hope that Putin is only going to give that ultimatum. He's not going to make that decision to move forward with recognition today, and they will heed that ultimatum. They will push the Ukrainians into pulling their troops back from the Donbass, trying to secure a ceasefire there, trying to get the Minsk process reactivated, trying to do those things with the Ukrainians that they have not done up to now in order to avoid this crisis that is now brewing. In the alternative, it'll be a bleak future for everyone. Obviously for the Russians, but they're accustomed to that. They will absorb it and they are ready for it. In Europe, it might be less easy. I'll finish one last point. One particular point stood out for me about the Security Council session in Moscow, which is that one of the officials, I'm not sure of his name, made an observation that this whole story that we've been hearing over the last few months about a Russian invasion of Ukraine has been largely constructed within the US State Department. That is the State Department and presumably the hardliners within it who have in effect created this entire crisis. Well, I have no reason to doubt that. It's what the Russians believe. I don't have any information one way or the other, but it's consistent with what I have seen. So let's perhaps contemplate that and contemplate how it seems, if the Russians are to be believed, that a small group of people entrenched in the State Department, neocons planted there all the way back during the Bush-Cheney years, are still able to dominate and direct Western foreign policy in ways that are going to cause unhappiness and trouble for practically everyone. Well, thank you for joining me again today for this program, for this update. More from me on this topic soon. Remember what I said at the beginning of this program, to check us out on Rumble and Locals. Of course, we're also present on other platforms like Odyssey and SuperU. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also go to our shop and buy the things you will find there: magic mugs, sweatshirts, hoodies, bomber jackets, t-shirts, hats, whatever. And of course, also, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick this the like button, and please check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day until then.